Hi, this is Mr. Green and welcome to another historically defensible claim, the Armies of the Road. Vagabonds is a word we don't use much anymore. It comes from the Latin word for wanderer. Vague and vagabond actually have the same Latin root. I know you tuned in for word origins, right? It's like an SAT prep class. We have several other cool old-timey words for vagabonds, like roustabout, tramp, ragamuffin, vagrant, drifter, derelict, panhandler, malingerer, that's a good one, knockabout, and wait for it, homeless. I grew up in the 80s, and people talked about homelessness a lot. My first memory of the issue was comic relief. Remember comic relief? It's the most 80s thing ever. Edgy lefty comics put on a comedic version of Live Aid in response to the enormous spike in the homeless population that symbolized the dark side of Reagan's America. Well, now homelessness is back on the front page, but we don't even get a comic show anymore. We just get reports like this.
Seattle's homeless population is surging. The city is suffocating under garbage produced by hundreds of homeless camps. Rather than take action, the city council has enabled the problem and even recently suggested the garbage is really left by middle-class residents who are trying to frame the homeless. A local news broadcast recently grabbed national headlines by warning that Seattle is dying. The city becomes unlivable for regular families. For day 3 of our Homeless in America series, our producer Charlie Cougar visited Seattle to get an up-close look at what is happening there. Seattle's homelessness crisis is deeply connected to the city's drug crisis. That's what we learned when we visited this sprawling encampment off of Interstate 5.
The attitude you see in this Tucker Carlson report is not new. I linked the full report below. But some things have changed. Carlson doesn't overtly blame the homeless for their own situation, but links it most fully to drug addiction and family breakdown, both problems that can seem to come from one's own character. Really individual failings, nothing systemic to see here.
The residents were cleaning up their camp. It was littered with syringes.
But I would argue this report and others like it by Carlson is less interested in causes or solutions of homelessness and more about tone. And the tone is, be afraid of the homeless. They're not from around here. They're drifters. He uses words like vagrants. They bring crime, disease, idleness. They're most interested in government handouts to facilitate their laziness. Here's a smattering from the comments for that Tucker Carlson report. I live about 20 minutes from Seattle. This is not exaggerated. Seattle used to be a safe city 6 or 7 years ago. Now it's overrun with homelessness. I always conceal carry downtown and watch where I step. Hep C is common here as well. If you send out an open invitation to the dregs of society, they will come in great numbers. You cannot deal with the question of homelessness until you determine at which point personal responsibility kicks in. Now you get the idea. I cherry-picked this for sure, but it's pretty reflective, and you can see for yourself. Again, the link's below. The thing is, to a student of European history, this kind of poor shaming really whisks me back to a simpler time, 16th century Tudor England. A lot of the sentiments Fox News and those on the right express about the increase in homelessness over the last few years is pretty beat for beat with Tudor-era attitudes toward the homeless, or vagabonds as they most often called them. Tudor England dealt with an explosion, or so it seemed to them at the time, of widespread homelessness and vagabondage during the 16th century. There's tons of potential causes for this, most of them economic, some are socio-political, but Tucker actually nailed a few of them during his hand-waving explanation of potentially systemic problems.
How many of the homeless we talked to were not mentally ill. Many were totally coherent. Some of them were witty, even. Another explanation is that sky-high housing prices in places like California force families out of their homes. And that can be a factor, too. But it's not the overall answer to the question, what's going on?
Sure, housing prices, but have you seen this guy shooting up heroin on the street? Inflation was rife in the 16th century due to something called the price revolution. It's partially the result of literally tons of silver flowing from the New World silver mines driving up prices, but as usual, and as today, wages lagged behind prices, especially as populations increased in early modern Europe. Environment also played a big role in this, as Europe was plunged into something called the Little Ice Age during this period, and it only got worse during the 17th century. This modest drop in temperatures caused all kinds of problems for people living on the economic margins. Remember, this was an agricultural society, so changes in climate really had a big effect. Just imagine what a modest rise in temperatures will cause globally. The final thing that caused this spike in vagabonds was something called enclosure and changes in how land was owned and used. During the Middle Ages, there were large tracts of commonly owned lands that provided sustenance for many of the poor of the village. They could use the common fields as pasture for their animals, and those animals provided milk. Common forests provided firewood and game. You get the idea. Well, in the name of efficiency and sheep raising, which was more profitable, these lands were enclosed, often by act of parliament. It was dominated by wealthy landowners, you see. These enclosures privatized common lands, displaced rural settlements, and shifted life from difficult to impossible for many English peasants. The other thing that it did were big hikes in rent. Many small farmers did not own their own lands at all, but signed contracts with usually noble landlords. As commercial farming and enclosed farms became more common, these landlords could jack up rents, almost at will. It was called rent racking, a fitting name. This forced many poor off the land, and to hear one English priest tell it in 1596, though they do labor and take pains in their vocation and trade, yet by reason of the extremity of the world, for that their rents are so great, the prices of all necessities so dear, and the hearts of men so hardened, they cannot live by their labor, nor maintain their charge, but suffer want and are poor. This guy is actually pretty compassionate, but others at the time not so much, because many of these displaced individuals took to the roads, some falling in with highwaymen and brigands, others becoming common beggars, in some cases feigning insanity. Still more drifted to the towns, hoping for work or charity, or both. Fear of social upheaval from these beggars and vagabonds was rife. Like the Jodes on the way to California, the people of the roads were mistrusted and despised in every town or community they approached. According to one English gentleman in 1549, in response to a rebel movement that would potentially, quote, stir up uproars of people, hurly-burlies of vagabonds, routs of robbers who would swarm in every corner of the realm, and not only lie loitering under hedges, but also stand sturdily in cities, and beg boldly at every door, stand in the highway to ask their alms, whom you would be afraid to say nay unto, honestly, lest they take it away from you violently. Statistics are really tough to ferret out from this period, but it looks like anywhere from 15 to 30% of urban populations were in need of some sort of assistance to stave off hunger and death. In other words, in deep, deep poverty. No worries. Tudor government rushed into action with some really specifically named laws, like the Vagabonds and Beggars Act of 1494, or the 1536 Act for Punishment of Sturdy Vagabonds and Beggars, or just straight up the Poor Laws. These laws address the vagabond issue with some of the tough love recommended by Tucker Carlson's commenters. For example, the 1531 Vagabond Act, signed by Henry VIII, called for vagabonds begging without a begging license, which, yes, that was a thing, to be whipped and then booted out of town. The 1547 Vagabonds Act, in effect for only 3 years because it was so harsh, actually called for the homeless to be enslaved for 2 years, post-whipping, of course, and for child vagabonds to become apprentices, aka slaves, until their 20s. Henry's law spelled out the ideology behind it. Quote, be it further enacted that if any man or woman, being holy and mighty in body, and able to labor, having no land, master, nor using any lawful merchandise, whereby he might get his living, be vagrant, then it shall be lawful to the constables and all the king's officers to arrest said vagabonds and idle persons, and then they be tied to the end of a cart naked and beaten with whips. He should then return forthwith to the place where he was born, and there put himself to labor as a true man oweth to. Think back to the comments from the Tucker Carlson report earlier. Why are these people homeless and begging? They don't want to work. That's the mentality. Henry tells them to get a job or get whipped. Tucker more implies it, but it comes through loud and clear. What neither really acknowledges is that maybe they have jobs. 25% of homeless Americans work, according to The Week, but the costs of housing and the wages paid in this work are simply not enough to provide the means for a living. Tudor justice for vagabonds was harsh, But did the English state provide any further poor relief? They definitely did, but it's problematic. Tudor England was willing to help the homeless, but a key provider of the social safety net in England were monasteries. Oops, Henry VIII dissolved those in 1536, same year as one of his vagabond acts, sold off their property, often to his cronies, who then evicted many of the monastery tenant farmers and enclosed the land for commercial agriculture. The Tudor state did not want to pick up the tab for the homeless, or any poor relief, so they pushed it off to private charities. But this often didn't work. The voluntary contributions from more well-heeled Englishmen were never enough. Finally, in the 1590s, things deteriorated to the point where Elizabeth's government passed the Poor Law of 1601. This law somewhat decriminalized poverty and provided a share of poor relief through state-controlled Anglican church, but most towns didn't want to follow through with it consistently, and there was very little government oversight. Taxpayers didn't want to cover it, and no town wanted to provide much help because it felt it would become a magnet for more vagrants, and no real attempt was made to differentiate between professional vagabonds or those who had just fallen on hard economic times, or individuals who were mentally ill, often a big component of the begging and homeless population. These folks were often referred to as Tom o' Bedlams, who traveled the country between stints in private and state insane asylums, like Bedlam in London. And so it is today, with 25% of the homeless population suffering from severe mental illness, cast off by the government, hospital closures. This is something even Tucker Carlson concedes is a problem before quickly veering back to drug-addicted homeless as something to be afraid of. Tucker paints a picture of Seattle similar to many reports of well-to-do Europeans in the 1500s. I focused on Tudor England, but the problem was Europe-wide. The homeless can seem scary and intimidating to passers-by, especially ones suffering from mental illness. Transient populations scare settled ones. My neighbor started renting out his house a few years ago, and when he moved away and started renting it, it was often a source of trepidation for my wife and I. Whenever the tenant would change, who's it going to be? Will they maintain the property like they owned it? But maybe why should they, since it enriches another person? The recent rise in homelessness exacerbates these kind of fears. According to The Week in 2017, about 550,000 Americans were homeless, about a 1% increase from 2016. Many cities do try to help. About 2/3 of the population of homeless are in shelters. But it's complicated when they shell out that aid. Many cities ban sleeping in your car or limit RVs because they're unseemly to property owners. Pitching tents in common lands like parks is often banned, and San Francisco and Denver have even provided free one-way bus tickets to the homeless to get out of town. They don't whip them first like Henry VIII would have, but the connection to the Vagabond Act of Tudor England is obvious. Get your lazy ass out of town. Our upright taxpayers shouldn't shoulder the burden for your idleness. But for the most people that are homeless, the reason they're on the street is they can't afford a home. The housing market does not provide enough stock in affordable housing for most Americans, period. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and The Week, while wage growth has remained flat over the past 20 years, the median rent for a vacant home or apartment has doubled over the same period to about $910 a month in 2017. In Utah, they provide no-strings-attached homes at a lower cost than the ping-ponging of homeless from emergency rooms to shelters to the street to the police station and then around again. According to one study, a homeless person could cost the state around $40,000 a year, while an apartment costs $17,000. But are there enough apartments? Nope. Gentrification and the housing market have seen to that. Not enough land, rents driven up by greedy landlords, buying up land and commercializing their properties, stagnant wages, rising prices, changes in the climate. Wow, this sounds familiar. And all too predictably, so is the reaction of many Americans, led by the Tucker Carlsons of the world. Here's a list of Fox News headlines on their helpful homeless crisis tab. California homeless man breaks into bank to microwave Hot Pockets. It was worth it. Homeless San Francisco man, well known for threatening locals, accused of killing 94-year-old man. Austin homeless set up shop at Camp Rat, for the homeless, run by the homeless. The message is clear. The homeless are either ridiculous or to be feared, or both. Whip 'em, run 'em, out of town. It's their fault anyway, these lazy bums. No structural problems could possibly have created this situation, and it's the soft-headed liberal elites and Democrats that create and perpetuate this kind of idling. It's like Nancy Pelosi wants these vagrants to crap on the streets. And that basically sums up Tucker's sensationalist reporting on the topic. The central message is clear. The homeless are drug-addled leeches, a threat to civilized society. Democrats and the abandonment of traditional families are to blame. These vagabonds need some of that tough love, and don't bother with any empathy. In a later video in the Homelessness series, he did a whole series, Tucker Carlson says, homelessness is a complex problem that defies an obvious solution.
This is a complicated problem. There's no obvious solution, at least no obvious one solution.
Well, that's where Tucker and I disagree. If someone's homeless, the solution is simplicity itself. Give them a home. We have thousands and thousands of vacant ones. Just ask Airbnb, they'll tell you all about it. Folks beaten down by poverty, often of the generational variety, are sometimes frustrating to try and help. And these kind of social problems may seem insoluble, but they're only insoluble because we won't move beyond the mindset that got us to 500,000 Americans on the street. The inconvenient truth of homelessness is that the late capitalist neoliberal economy of the United States is leaving a lot of people behind. And this pandemic ain't helping, as it drives more and more of our economically and socially marginalized fellow Americans over the financial and mental health cliff and onto the roads.
Feeling alone.